We can go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to this morning's poster session. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Whoops. I don't think that works. Did that work?
Yeah, we saw the slide. It just wasn't in full screen.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Okay.
So
today's session is the Alaska Amphibious Community Seismic Experiment and more poster session. It's going to run for the next hour, the first 30 minutes of which will be for lightning presentations on all the posters in the session. And then the second half hour will be for questions and discussions on all of the talks. So the order of the speakers you can see here down below on that slide. So let's go ahead and get started with Geoff Abers giving us an introduction.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks for putting this together, and thanks to Casey too for putting all of this together. It's a conversation before. This has been a really great opportunity to reconnect with a lot of people. There's also, I think, the first meeting, chance to talk about AACE, is how I pronounce it, Alaska Amphibious Community Seismic Experiment, since really people have had a chance to look at the data we've collected. So I'm just going to say a few words about the project as a whole. We talked about the nature of community experiments last week in a panel, but this just shows you a list of the original AACE PI team. We've accreted a few other people as the project goes on, and I'll try to call those people out as we go. But as you can see, we have a lot of people who help put this together. Next slide. So Helen, do you have the slide controls? Yeah, okay. The idea here is, well, there are a lot of ideas behind this, but while the transportable array was in Alaska, it's shown a spotlight on an opportunity to really look at this whole system from outer rise to the megathrust that makes some of the planet's biggest earthquakes, to the arc segment of the arc that made the 20th century's largest volcanic eruption in Katmai, into the far back arc. This is sort of one of the planet's classic subduction systems. So in order to do this, we needed to go amphibious. We put out 75 broadband ocean bottom seismometers. They're the circles, well, the ones that are in the water. The little teal squares are the permanent stations or the transportable array stations. These are supplemented by 30 onshore stations to densify this, with a particularly dense transect through Kodiak Island. Some engineering was done so that these OBSs could stay in the water for 2 summers and an intervening winter that gives us 15 months of continuous recording. And we also tried to add on as much as possible to enhance the data set. So the ones with red circles or squares around them have accelerometers attached. All of them have some kind of pressure gauges, either the APG, the absolute, or differential pressure gauges. The legend shows which. Temperature sensors were put on by Paul Johnson's group at Washington on all of these things. And there are a bunch of other add-on experiments that have gone as well. And then I think, and then the important thing, of course, is a community experiment. The data is open. The design was a public process. Next slide, please. And this is just a quick view of, we actually got OBSs back. This is showing a Woods Hole, sort of regular one on the left, and one of these trawl resistant mount ones that were built for shallow water on the right. Next slide, please. As well as sort of the main data set, we had a bunch of these ancillary add-on experiments. Ann Bissell wrote a supplement actually to use the Langseth air guns. That was along the red path there. And this is some shipboard process reflection data in the lower left. Lindsay Worthington took the lead on another supplement to put 398 nodes out on the road system of Kodiak. Kodiak does have a road. And so the little inset shows you the places where those are. This is right on top of the middle of the 1964 rupture zone. So this is a really unique high density data set. We had extra ship time to collect multi-beam. Very little of the deep water has actually been that well mapped in this region. This shows, for example, mapping of some of the outer rise normal fault structure off of the Shumagan Islands. And then we've also, and this is Barcheck's going to talk about this next, I've been developing a public catalog. Next slide, please. Doing this as a community exercise in particular, but just having all of this going on at the same time gave us a lot of opportunities for education outreach. Brea Adams is going to talk about some of this in a couple of days and presentation she's making at this meeting. But every one of the cruises we had, there were 2 deployment and 2 recovery cruises, and in the airgun cruise had apply to sail open application system berths for early career graduate students, early career professionals. Some berths were reserved for K-12 educators from the Alaska region, science educators who took the content that they were developing onshore and using it to expand what they're doing. We had an undergraduate, a short course on Kodiak at the same time as the nodal deployment was going on. So there's a lot of opportunities for undergraduates to engage there. We've also been keeping up a blog for every one of these things. It's been very popular web pages with EOS article. It adds up to, I think, about 41 total participants, in addition to 5 of our own students who helped with more sort of the land logistics and some of the data processing. Next slide. And again, Grace will talk more about the catalog, but one of the things that we really pushed for here is to get as much data as possible out to as many people, out to the world as openly as possible. This worked in Cascadia extraordinarily well. Doug Toomey in his beautiful plot showing the rate of increase of use of unique users at the IRIS data center for just, while the experiment was producing its first couple of years of data. And then Grace will show, but we have released the first half of the catalog a couple of weeks ago. It's available through sort of the standard USGS catalog retrieval tools. Last slide. So that's sort of the big idea. You'll see a lot more. I'm excited to see what science is being done with this. I just added this little box of statistics. 105 broadband seismometers we deployed. It's about 3.5 terabytes. About doubles it with the nodes. 5 cruises sailed 12,000 nautical miles. That's about halfway around the planet. There were about, with all of the land and sea trips, there's 14 expeditions to Alaska. We bought 73 plane tickets. I had 41 students at sea in the field. And just, from my perspective, we had over 150 conference calls before we were done collecting the data. And I see over 4,000 emails in my ACE box. Anyways, I urge you all to have a look at some of the online material we have, and can't wait to see what everyone else has to say. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Geoff. We're going to move on to Grace Barcheck now.
All right, hi everyone. So I am here to tell you about a catalog of local earthquakes being built for the ACE deployment. So as Geoff mentioned, ACE is a community experiment and all the data was publicly available as quickly as possible. And so to help facilitate rapid use of this data, we were funded to create a catalog of local earthquakes within the footprint of the ACE network. It has taken a little bit longer than we expected because of the pandemic. But so I'm just sort of reporting on where we stand right now with this. The catalog itself is being generated by the Alaska Earthquake Center with Natalia Rupert as the lead. And so the catalog is being generated following the same processing that the Alaska Earthquake Center uses to generate their just like general Alaska catalog. And so earthquakes are preliminarily detected and located using Antelope, and then student analysts adjust picks and relocate stuff and throw out bad earthquakes. And then at the end, Natalia double checks everything. And so currently this process is finished from May through December of 2018. So we're about halfway through the deployment. Like I said, it took a little bit longer than expected because of the pandemic. And in that time period, there are 3,829 earthquakes in the catalog, and about 30% of them are new. So the new earthquakes are shown in this map over here on the right. Basically, all the black earthquakes were events that were pre-existing in the catalog. And then the red, orange, and brown dots are new earthquakes that have been detected from May through December 2018. And the color scale is wrong. So if it makes more sense to you, the red earthquakes are actually the shallow ones. So apologies for that. Yeah, and so you can see where all the new earthquakes are. And in this new catalog, the magnitude of completeness is about 0.2 magnitude units lower across the whole network. And then it's sort of regionally variable depending on what part of the network you're interested in. This first chunk of the data, May through December of 2018, is currently publicly available via Comcat. And so if you go to, for example, the earthquakes.usgs.gov and search for search earthquakes webpage, if you select under advanced options, if you go to catalog and select ACE, you can access all of these new earthquakes and all of the pics right now. I also on my poster have some hyperlinks to other formats that might be helpful as well. So hopefully this catalog allows the community to get some exciting new research done rapidly. Next slide, please. And so then I also have on my poster, I have just 2 additional projects that we're working on sort of based on this catalog. The first is comparing those like hand-checked pics, analyst-checked pics with the performance of a machine learning algorithm called EQTransformer. So I won't go into details here, but there are more details on my poster. And essentially we're trying to see like what percentage of pics that are in the catalog are also detected by EQTransformer, and then how accurate are they? And we're finding that it performs a little bit less well on OBS, which is perhaps not surprising. And so we're also working on a project to train the EQTransformer model using that ACE catalog with the hand-checked pics. The other thing that we are working on in collaboration with also Emily Rowland and Susan Schwartz is creating an improved catalog for the Shumagan Islands region. We're using essentially what we learned about EQTransformer to try and detect more small earthquakes, sort of in the area around the Shumagan Islands where there were a couple of big earthquakes last year. And so, sorry, this map is pretty bad, but you can kind of see the outlines of the Alaska Peninsula and the Shumagan Islands in light gray. And essentially what the map is showing is that after processing 6 months of the data in 2018, we find about 300 additional small earthquakes in this region. And that number is likely to go down as I sort of continue with quality control on this catalog. So these are very preliminary, but we're definitely finding more small earthquakes in this area. So if any of this is interesting to you, please check out my poster or send me an email. My email is down there in the corner. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we'll move on to our next speaker, which is Donna Shillington.
Hi, good morning, everyone. And thanks to the organizers for putting together this session and including me, even though I'm not strictly working on ACE data, I am in the neighborhood. So my colleagues and I have been working on some data that was from before ACE, collected in 2011. And here in this poster, we want to present some new constraints on the crustal structure of the Shumagan Gap. Next slide. So as you may know, the reason that this is such an exciting place to study is that we have these huge along strike changes in earthquake behavior and geodetic coupling, with very low coupling in the Shumagan Gap compared to the relatively locked Semiti segment. And so it was very exciting when last July there was a magnitude 7.8 earthquake that occurred in the eastern part of the Shumagan Gap. And so the right panel here shows one of the published slip models for this earthquake, which is the kind of red to yellow colors, and the aftershocks of that earthquake in blue. So those are just earthquakes from July to October of 2020. And so what I'm going to show you in this presentation is a new seismic velocity model from one of the OBS profiles from the ALUT experiment, which is shown with the kind of red lines and red dots. But a new velocity model that's kind of just to the west of that, most of that earthquake slip, and we'll also look at a little bit of the reflection data. Next slide. And so without any introduction, here's our new velocity model that's across the Shumagans, and you can see the location of the line there in yellow. The new contribution of this model is really the structure of the overriding plate. There's a couple interesting features. We see a pretty big change in crustal velocity as we go landward, and we think that that could be the sort of signature of a series of accreted terrains that sort of construct the overriding plate in this area. And so you can kind of see the interpretations there on the lower panel. We also have some constraints on the depth of the MOHO of the overriding plate, and see that it intersects the plate boundary at around a depth of 32 kilometers. And from our previous seismic reflection results, this is where we have a down dip change in the character of reflections off of the plate boundary from a narrower and simpler seismic reflection at shallower depths to a wide band of reflectivity at lower depths, and kind of confirms our previous idea that perhaps where the plate boundary intersects the four-arc mantle wedge, you might have a kind of a broadening of that cumulative deformation zone where you have kind of a tectonic mixing of metamorphosed sediments, oceanic, upper crust, and upper mantle is seen in some exhumed sections. And so, yeah, so that we're excited about that. So next slide. And so now we can kind of compare this structure to provide further context for the recent earthquake that happened in the Shumagins. And so again, the slip model is there on the left, and now I'm showing you the new velocity model, which is a Lute line 5, which is just to the west of that slip area, and a seismic reflection profile that's mostly just to the east of that slip area, and plotted on these reflection images and velocity models are aftershocks of the earthquake, and then above them are kind of extracted amounts of slip, both along the line in the solid line, and then the kind of maximum slip in the dotted line. And from this, we can see that, you know, at least some and maybe much of the slip seems to have happened around or below the seismic MOHO, and perhaps the heterogeneity of this part of the plate boundary could explain some of the patchiness that's seen in some of the slip models. So please come and discuss this with me at my poster. I'm very excited about this stuff and actively working on it. So thanks.
Thanks, Donna. We'll now move on to our next speaker, Erik Fredrickson.
Hey everyone, yeah, my name's Erik Fredrickson. I'm a graduate student at the University of Washington. Next slide. So I've been working with the absolute pressure gauge data out of the ACE deployment for the purposes of seafloor pressure geodesy. And in particular, my interest lies in better understanding oceanographic processes and how they manifest as bottom pressure signals so that we can really improve our resolution on these pressure data. So on the left-hand side here, I have my version of the experiment map with the black infilled triangles indicating the APGs that return data from the experiment. And then the two plots on the right, I show the pressure data that have been filtered for tides. In the center is from the continental shelf, and on the right is from the continental slope and the abyssal plain, and kind of the big picture things to look at here, and you can look more closely if you come to my poster space, is that generally the signals are significantly larger on the shelf, but in both cases, even after removing the tides, there are significant oceanographic essentially noise on these data that I want to better understand so we can improve our tectonic resolution. Next slide. I won't talk about this much, but we also have a regional oceanographic model for this area. And this is a really useful tool because it provides a much higher resolution picture of these oceanographic processes than we get from kind of our point pressure observations. And so this can help us better understand those processes that might be introducing noise. Next slide. Just to kind of paint with a broad brush, the model predicts our observations really well on the continental shelf, which you can see on the left-hand plot there. In blue is our pressure data from the ACE deployment, and then in red is the predicted pressure at the same location from the model. The black curve below is the difference between those two. But on the slope or out on the abyssal plain, it doesn't do as good of a job predicting. Next slide. I won't kind of explain this in detail, but again, you can come to my poster, but the model and our observations show comparable spatial patterns in how the oceanographic pressure kind of manifests itself over the region, which is a good indication that the model is kind of getting the dynamics of what we see in the pressure observations correct. Next. Okay, so like kind of the main idea with pressure geodesy is that your bottom pressure measurement is sensitive to the weight of the overlying water. And so that can change, you know, as the ocean height changes over the sensor. but it can also change if your seafloor moves up or down, right? And so the oceanographic signals are really large and pose kind of a complication to see through. And so, as mentioned, you can kind of pretty easily filter out the tidal signals, but even in doing so, there are kind of high residual signals from other oceanographic processes. And so kind of the standard way to deal with this is to subtract out from all of your pressure records a reference pressure, which is generally on the incoming plate where you don't expect any deformation, and it's presumed to represent the regional oceanography. And so I've kind of shown a kind of mock-up example of that here, where on the left we have all our pressure records. On the right, I've subtracted out the kind of J34A, the central record, from all the others. And you can see that it does eliminate a lot of the noise. However, it has kind of mixed efficacy from one station to another. And so my work is focused on how can we improve this differencing technique to have it kind of work really consistently across stations. Next. And so here are kind of some results out of the ACE data. Again, we have shelf pressures in the center and then kind of slope abyss pressures on the right. And what we've done here is rather than differencing with a station on the incoming plate, we're instead selecting a station that's deployed at a comparable depth. And this is consistent with results I found in Cascadia in 2019, that these pressure signals are largely coherent along isobaths. So even at large separations on the scale of hundreds of kilometers, the pressure records are remarkably similar. And so you can subtract one pressure record from another at a large distance where you would not expect to have the same tectonic deformation, and very effectively reduce the oceanographic signal. Next slide. And something we've been working on with these Alaska data that's new is that you can also generate what we're calling kind of a network average pressure, and it also seems to work really well. And so in this case, we essentially create an average pressure on the shelf from all the stations and an average pressure on the slope or abyss from all those stations, and subtract that from each individual pressure record. And this has the benefit of you're not going to kind of introduce artifacts that are unique to one pressure record. And if there is any kind of distributed tectonic deformation, by averaging over the whole network, you're minimizing kind of the effect of potentially subtracting that out. Next slide. Yeah, this is just here to show that we're also working with some other proxies, and they kind of have mixed effectiveness. If you want to talk more about that, reach out to me. Next. And then finally, we're also working on doing some synthetic detection tests by introducing ramps into these pressure data and trying to detect them, and also assessing essentially the statistical significance of the kind of calculated size of those ramps. I'm happy to talk more about that as well. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We'll now move on to our next speaker, Zongshan Li.
Hello everyone. I will introduce our new cross and environmental structure of the Alaska subduction zone from joint version of the Rayleigh wave dispersion and the reserve functions. In this lecture talk, I will only briefly talk about the method. So we use the data from the ACE project, the transportable array, and other land networks. Then this 3D model is developed by inverting the Rayleigh wave velocities from the both ambient noise and earthquake data, as well as reserve functions. We're using a Bayesian Monte method. We'll go to the result. We observe the two main features. First is, as shown here, is a band of the thick low velocity for crust. First, we could look at the figure on the right. It is a crust of thickness that from the inverted 3D model. As you will see, that's in the fork region from the Kodiak Islands to the Seismic Islands. This has a thicker crust than the even than the arc region. And here we choose one cross section crossing the Kodiak Islands that perpendicular to the change, and it will see more distinct. They see that the fork region beneath the Kodiak Island has a thicker crust. Okay. Another thing is a distinct incoming plate hydration and stripping gap. Yeah. Please go to the next slide. Yeah. So here we choose several cross lines that are normal to the trench from the west to the east. to see this variation along the strike. So we'll first go to this Sherman Gap region. This cross-section, that's the incomplete as well as a part of the forward region, it show a very interesting the velocity reduction at the upper mantle region. If you look at this is one profile that choose very close to the change axis. This profile, the upper mantle part has a velocity reduction clearly seen here. So this, if we're assuming that pristine oceanic plate has upper mantle velocity has a 4.6 kilometers per second, then this reduction goes to 3.9. This is about a 15% velocity reduction, and the extent is the reduction is extended to at least 12 kilometers beneath the borehole. Well, as I go to the other region, like the semantic segment, this velocity reduction is much more weaker. It's mostly about 11% velocity reduction. This result is consistent with a previous active source study by Shillington detectors paper in 2015. And comparing with that in the Mariana Income plate at 10 times 2018, this hydration magnitude is still less. And this figure is I choose several points that close to the trend on each line, cross the line, and show their profile. The way I choose close to the line, but not close to the trend, but not on the trend, is to somehow avoid the smoothing effect. For this node, you will see that TT1 is the one crossing the Sherman Gap, and others is the one on the more eastern side. You will see the Sherman Gap is one that's distinct different with the others. Well, the other profiles that's trend on the east is generally pretty uniform. Thanks.
Thank you. We're now going to switch gears away from Alaska, and our next speaker will be Joachim Braumiller.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, this is going to be quite different from the previous talks, specifically mentioning Alaska and staying there. I'm looking at a more global type of problem, and that is, what is the seismic moment release pattern along oceanic transform faults? It's sort of a study that came out of basically my PhD thesis, where I studied one, and I was looking into finding out, or was interested in finding out, how is this really behaving on a global scale. As you notice from the map on the left, that shows in red and in yellow the oceanic transform faults, that in general, those things are fairly remote. And very few detailed studies so far exist where ocean bottom seismometers have been deployed for a period of a year or so to get detailed studies out of them. So the seismic behavior of those oceanic transform faults is usually described in terms of average behavior of the average seismic coupling. And seismic coupling, I mean at what part of the plate motions are accommodated by earthquakes. So you basically sum the seismic moment over all earthquakes along an oceanic transform fault, and you divide it by the period of the time you are looking at, the time period, and you get a rate from the earthquakes, and you compare that with the plate motion rate from the plate motion models. And interestingly enough, when you do that on a global set of observations, it's a study by Margaret Butker and Tom Jordan in 2004, and an update by Monika Wolfson-Schwer and Margaret Butker in 2019. The global average is approximately 0.2. That means 20% of the seismic of the plate motions are accounted for by earthquakes, by seismic motion, and about 80% of the motion has to be aseismic. Next slide, please. So this is the first observation that I'm going with, is this global average seismic coupling is pretty low, so it's 0.2. On the other hand, we also have seen that large earthquakes, at least at some of the oceanic transform faults, repeat quasi-periodically. And those patches where those repeating earthquakes are happening are fully coupled. basically meaning that all the plate motions are accounted for by those large earthquakes. The example is on the left-hand side. It's from the Gopher transform fault in the East Pacific Ridge area. And the study originally came from Geoff McGuire, and Monica Wolfson, Schwer, and Margaret Böttger have also been working very intensely on the seismicity behavior there. The bottom left shows the map of the area where they observed those repeating earthquakes. And then the top shows a long strike distance and left to right. And the y-axis is the occurrence of the earthquakes. And for example, all those red dots on the left show one patch of fault that ruptures repeatedly in large earthquake. And each red dot represents one large earthquake. So on average, they happen about every 5 to 6 years on that fault patch. So what is the implication of having overall, on average, low seismic coupling and having patches of fully coupled and fault patches that have repeating large earthquakes? In some ways, it's very simple. That basically means that seismic coupling has to vary along strike of an oceanic transform fault. And something that is not really that surprising either in some ways. It's just that for oceanic transform faults, because of their remoteness, you have been known not that much about how they behave overall, and that's why the averages were used. I've been studying this for the Blanco transform fault offshore Oregon. The map on the right shows the location. It's plate boundary between the Pacific and the Fuca plate. And the figure in the middle basically shows the along strike slip rate of the Blanco transform fault based on earthquakes. So the 0 is the intersection of the Blanco transform with the Fuca ridge, and about 350 kilometers or so is the intersection of the Blanco transform with the Goda ridge. And so in between, everything under the blue line, or the blue colored area, is how much seismic moment was released by earthquakes. And the red horizontal line shows the full plate motion. So you can see that it's the blue kind of area is varying a lot from west to east, and that there are a few areas where the blue area touches the red line. So these are areas that are fully coupled. And Margaret Böttger and Geoff McGuire also found that the eastern part that is fully coupled basically consists of two repeating earthquake patches that are adjacent to each other. So this is basically the background information. And now I'm in the next slide, please. I want to expand that to a more general type of observation. And what I'm showing you today are observations from the slowed oceanic transform faults in the Atlantic and in the Arctic area. So on the left shows the map of the Atlantic, and the inside is the Arctic Ocean. And each of those red ellipses shows one of the transform faults that I studied. So the main questions are, and I put them in very simplistic sort of terms, is, are the lateral variations of seismic coupling common? My answer to that is yes. And the next question is, how common are repeating earthquake patches? And interestingly enough, that is quite variable. And there are two examples that I show on this figure too. One is from the northern part, the oceanographic transform fault, where in the middle you see the seismic slip rate as a function of a long strike distance of the transform. Everything under the green curve in the middle shows how much seismic slip is released during the earthquakes. And you can see that there are basically two patches that are fully coupled, where the green area touches the red line, which is the full coupling. The average, if you do it over the entire fault, is much lower. And it's basically about a third of the motion is accounted for by seismic activity. And the halfway covered figure on the right with the x-axis distance and the y-axis time shows the two patches, and the large green and the orange dots are basically magnitude 6 and larger earthquakes that seem to, particularly for the green area, for the green dots, repeat in some sort of a quasi-periodic type of fashion. On the lower right, I show the slip distribution for another oceanic transform fault that shows very little seismic coupling, in the order of less than 10%, and also has no repeating earthquakes and no fully coupled patches. the motion rates are not that much different. One is about 2 centimeters per year, the other was 3 centimeters per year. Both of those transform systems are on the order of 140 to 200 kilometers long, so that's not too much difference, and both are pretty well developed oceanic transform faults. So it's a little puzzling to me right now why this behavior is so different, and I think answers to that probably require us to look in more detail at some of the very low coupling seismic, low coupled oceanic transform faults in terms of their fault zone properties. If you want to know more about it, please check out my poster presentation and ask me questions either via the chat or via email or any other way. I'm happy to answer or discuss things with you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move on to our next speaker, Hongfeng Yang.
Oh, hi. Well, hello from Hong Kong just after the midnight. Well, I'm going to switch gear now to Southern Mariana, the deepest spot on the Earth. On the very left, the figure is showing the location near the Challenger Deep. Well, due to the small space, so I didn't list all the authors over here. Please do check out our poster presentation where I list all the collaborators over there. This is actually the first ocean bottom seismic experiment done in that region in late 2016, and then some other follow-up expeditions have been carried out in 2017 to 2018 also. So here I just want to highlight two major features. One is the velocity structure that is derived from relief wave tomography. To this PowerPoint to the very right, in Southern Mariana, basically the tomography velocity shows in the incoming plate, the velocity is quite low in the upper mantle, so indicating the mantle hydration. And that degree of the velocity is actually similar to what is found out in Central Mariana. In the lower panel of the B and C, basically we are comparing with the 1D velocity between the Southern and Central Mariana. So with the right lines indicating the Southern Mariana, and then in the central part shown in the black. So in the panel C, which is in the incoming plate, so we can see near the depth range between 10 to 30 kilometers also. So velocities are pretty similar. But then if we look at the same depth range for the far arc, the velocities in Central Mariana is very, very low. So basically they suggest that the hydration degree in the incoming plate is similar. Well, because the subducting plates are, the Pacific plate and nearly the same age, very old. But then the velocities in the mantle wedge are very different. In Central Mariana, it's much lower, but in Southern Mariana, we don't find that very low velocities. So the degree of the hydration or serpentinization in the mantle wedge in Southern Mariana is not that low or not that much serpentinite comparing to Central Mariana. So that is also indicated by the abundant far arc seismicity, so which is shown in this black dots in the velocity profile in the Southern Mariana. So because if the far arc is relatively strong, it can still host a lot of earthquakes. But in Central Mariana, the far arc earthquakes are very rare, and most of the seismicities are near at the deeper down deep to this region or in the slab. So this is our first point on the velocity. So next slide, please. And this is the second slide I want to highlight on the earthquakes. So of course, with near field ocean bottom seismometer experiments, and we can find a lot more earthquakes in the region. And actually, I just want to highlight by this cluster interautorized. So the authorized earthquakes are often attributed to normal faulting that is related to plate bending. But then certainly in this region, we found the earthquake distribution in the authorized is non-uniform. So there's clearly a cluster over there. So normal faults are nearly everywhere in Southern Mariana and probably in other subduction zones in the authorized as well. But the question is why, some normal faults are more active than some ambient or some neighboring segment. So we believe the earthquakes are, associated with the stress distribution or the stress state in the plate. So that stress distribution is subject to the plate geometry, and clearly there's a clear along trench variation. So we developed a 3D plate bending model to incorporate such along trench variation of the subducting slab and also the down dip variation of the subducting slab geometry. So in Southern Mariana, basically using high resolution earthquake locations, and we found the subducting slab actually has a smaller dip angle near the west, and then when we move from the west to the east towards Guam, and then slab dip angle is increasing. So then we developed such a 3D plate bending model, and then we also derived the stress distribution within the incoming plate. Then we found out to show in the middle figure at the bottom, the color indicates the shear stress distribution within the incoming plate. So clearly we found there is a sharp change along the trench. So if we take a cross section along this blue line, and which is the smaller figure shown in the lower right panel, then we found along the distance along this blue line profile, then there is suddenly a abrupt change of the stress distribution within the incoming plate. And that region with the abrupt change of the stress is consistent where we found this earthquake cluster. So we propose that such a non-uniform stress distribution within the incoming plate may control the generation of the authorized seismicity, and including even some non-normal fault or thrust fault. And as we saw, although the moment tensor solutions are quite sparse over here, but there are some like strike slip earthquakes in the region. So that could be the mechanism controlled by the slab geometry change along the trench. So if you are interested, and then please check out our poster presentation. And thank you very much.
Great, thank you. We'll move on now to our next speaker, Hannah Mark. I also want to mention, I see that there's a lot of great discussion already going on in the chat, and especially since we're running a little bit over, please feel free to make use of the chat, both speakers and audience members, to ask questions to specific speakers. But Hannah Mark.
All right, thanks, Helen. So I've got just 2 slides for you today. The first has to do with motivation, the second with some results that we've got on this project so far. So to start with what we're actually trying to do here, the question that we're interested in is one that I think a lot of us would like answers to, as has already been discussed in this session, and that is how much water do incoming plates and subduction zones carry into the mantle? In particular here, we're looking at the Marianas Trench, Central Mariana, as one example of subduction zone. And the answer to that question depends on what I like to think of as the geometry of hydrous minerals, right? So how deep into the slab do we have hydration in the mantle? And then also when we talk about, using seismic velocity models to try and estimate volumes or fluxes of water, we often have to think in terms of converting some velocity reduction to, some teragrams per million year per kilometer kind of number. But if we think in terms of velocity reduction in a smooth model, would it be more accurate to consider the volume of water we would get if serpentinization was confined to narrow fault zones? That may be a more accurate way of thinking about the problem, but unfortunately, smooth tomographic models can't tell us much about that. So as an example, on the lower left side of this slide, I'm showing you an active source refraction model for VP. This is work by Melody Eimer in her thesis. And circled in red on that, you can see a region around sort of the hinge of the subducting plate where mantle velocities are reduced, and that's interpreted as showing serpentinization. But if we could, walk around down there by some magical process, maybe we would see something more like the cartoon above, where serpentine minerals are localized to narrow fault zones as opposed to some kind of bulk serpentinization of the mantle. So what we're trying to do with this project is to look at the anisotropic signature of these bend faults. So look at azimuthal anisotropy in the uppermost mantle of the incoming plate and try and use that as sort of an added constraint on the geometry of these minerals and propagate that back in combination with tomographic models to think about hydration. And so on the lower right, I'm just showing you, because this is a marine seismology symposium, I feel like we should look at some data. Also, it's pretty data. This is an OBS record section, or at least half of one, from our Marianas data set. And its travel times reduced at 8 kilometers per second. So you can see that I've underlined the mantle refraction, PN. So in this case, a little faster than 8. And basically what we're doing in terms of data and methods, I'll skip over most of the details, but we're looking at travel times of that phase. So if you go to the next slide, please. So what we see so far in a nutshell is that azimuthal anisotropy in the incoming plate at Central Marianas varies spatially. And what I mean by that is that if we look at the fast direction of anisotropy on sort of the farthest part of our array, as far east of the trench as we can go, the fast direction is approximately parallel to absolute plate motion. If you move closer to the trench axis, that fast direction rotates to nearly parallel to the strike of the bend faults that you can see in the bathymetry. And so that's really exciting, at least to me, because this is, I think, telling us that we can see a signature, sort of a signal of mineral fabrics in the uppermost mantle far from the trench that's being at least partially overprinted by a signal from aligned faults as we get closer to the trench. And on the plots on the right, I'm just showing you some of those results in graphical form. The 3 panels on the far right are velocity variations over 180 degrees of azimuth in 3 spatial bins. So the top one is closest to the trench, the bottom one is farthest from the trench. You can see where those bins are in the map in the bottom center. And then I've taken those 3 sort of velocity variation anisotropy curves and plotted them against each other with the isotropic background added back in the top centers. You can clearly see that rotation of the fast direction as those sort of 2 theta peaks shift over from around 120 far from the trench to closer to 160 north as we get close to the trench. There's also a change in the amplitude of the velocity variation, but as far as I can tell so far, that's not as robust a result. And so what we're working on now, and what I'd be happy to discuss with anyone at the poster or by email, is some synthetic calculations to look at effects of fault spacing and thickness on these anisotropy measurements, see if we can probe our data set for any kind of depth variation, although it's tricky with the slab geometry, and then integrate this particular anisotropy analysis with the surface wave models from Chen Tsai's work and the refraction models from Melody Eimer and Helen Feng. And that's all I got.
Thank you very much. And now we'll move on to our last presentation by Doug Weems.
Well, hi, I'm going to be talking about the study of mantle hydration in Mariana. It's kind of same general goals of the work that Hannah was just talking about. And my co-authors here are Dan Lizaraldi and 2 students, Chen Tsai and Melody Eimer. And I think Hannah already introduced part of the data set. So she was talking about the active source data set from the Mariana experiment. It was a combined passive and active experiment. So we also had 20 broadband OBSs and 5 hydrophones tethered in the water column, in addition to the 60 short period OBSs. And the broadband array stayed out for 1 year. Chen Tsai did Rayleigh wave tomography from ambient noise and from earthquakes using this data set to constrain the velocity structure of the incoming plate and the overriding plate. As you can see in the results, I won't talk much about the method here. In the results, these are 3 cross sections through the middle of this array. And you can see that the incoming Pacific plate, the velocity becomes increasingly slow at the top part of the mantle as we approach the trench and as we have faulting going on from plate bending faults. At the trench, the velocity reduction is considerable, and we estimate if this is due to bulk serpentinization that this would correspond to about 19% or 20% serpentinization down to a depth of about 24 kilometers beneath the moho. And this is a kind of a striking result because previously we knew that velocity was reduced at many subduction zones, but because this was all mostly active source work, we didn't have a very good constraint on how deep this velocity reduction goes. And this suggests that it goes fairly deep into the mantle, and thus increases our estimate of the water subducted into the mantle at Mariana by a factor of more than 4. And if that applies to other subduction zones globally, it increases the total water flux into the mantle by something like a factor of 3. Let's see, next slide, please. Yeah, so this also then correlates well with seismicity. We also studied seismicity from this array. And then in the middle figure here, it's comparing the tomographic model with the depth below seafloor of incoming plate, small earthquakes and incoming plate detected by the OBS array. And then you also see on the right a plot of the velocity sort of averaged near the trench. And you can see that the seismicity peaks at depths below seafloor of about between 20 and 30 kilometers. And that corresponds to sort of the lower half or so of this region that has reduced seismic velocities. And so this is showing the link, I think, between the small earthquakes on the faults and the hydration of the incoming plate. And they both agree fairly well with the depth extent of that hydration. The depth goes 20 to 25 kilometers into the mantle. And on the right, you see the correlation between the shear velocity reduction in the top figure, the bathymetry with increasing curvature all the way to the trench, and in the seismicity, which increases rapidly as you get close to the trench. The seismicity starts to, is observable about 120 kilometers away from the trench, and then becomes much, much larger within like 40 kilometers of the trench, in agreement with the increased curvature. Sometimes people call this outer rise seismicity. It's definitely not outer rise seismicity. It's basically inner trench slope seismicity would probably be a better way to describe it. Next slide. Next slide,
dear,
please.
sorry. It looks like Helen may have froze. So just a second. We're gonna try to get some.
That's the last one. So.
Okay, yeah, it almost worked. Let's see if she comes back. But in the meantime, I'm just bringing up slides and can take over. This is why you do backup slides, I guess.
Oh, you guys are thinking ahead.
Well, it still takes a little bit of time. Okay, so that's okay, present, and just a second, gonna
should be my third slide.
Okay.
While we're waiting, I'll just mention that we also saw with the Rayleigh wave tomography strong anisotropy, which also rotated from roughly plate motion, absolute plate motion to trench parallel fast directions as you go towards the trench, in agreement. That's very compatible with what Hannah was showing from the P wave anisotropy results. So there is a very large effect. To really study this, one needs to take into account the anisotropy as Hannah is doing.
Are you seeing the slide now?
No, it's still the same slide.
Oh, darn. Okay. Let's see. Sorry about that. Okay. Thought I had that right. Are you seeing this now?
I think it's still showing Helen's slide.
Oh, I think we have to manually choose which screen share we want to see. like in
You
the wheel
probably
option.
need to stop sharing her screen and then start to share your.
Yeah, I thought I did stop her, but apparently not. Okay, let me see if I can.
Maybe did she not give you host privilege?
Here, I'm just gonna withdraw that. Okay. And let's see if this works this time. Okay, are you seeing my screen now?
No.
No? Oh no. I have no idea how to get permissions back because
It looks like when at the top, where there's the green bar that says your like what screen you're viewing, there's a little button next to it that says view options.
Yeah.
And if you scroll down there, you'll see shared screens and it'll say either Helen or Casey. So you're going to want to select Casey's screen.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay.
I had no idea this was a feature of Zoom.
I didn't either until just now.
Okay.
Yeah. So
And
now
I am trying to make her stop sharing, but for some reason it's not letting me even do that. So, okay, but you can see your slide now.
Yes.
I don't see that option.
Let me see.
Yeah, Kristen, if you can try to get Helen's.
Yeah, if whoever is having issues, if you could just private chat me so I can try to figure it out.
Okay.
But I think everybody's ready to go with you, Doug, so you can go ahead.
Okay.
Helen says she's sorry too.
The last slide of the whole session. Wow, if it would have just held out for a little bit longer, we'd been fine. So this is the wide angle results from Melody Eimer's thesis. And this is kind of the basic data set that that Hannah was talking about. Melody was working just along the lines, and Hannah was working with all of the offline data. So analyzing the data along the lines, on the incoming plate on the left, you see that we also have the velocity reduction, the p-wave velocity. So there's the two different dense lines, north and south, and they both show velocity reduction, somewhat slightly different patterns. About 9% VP reduction near the trench from the bending faults. And if this is interpreted as bulk serpentinization, it would be like 17% serpentinization. And then on the right is the structure of the forearc, which I haven't talked very much about. And Mariana forearc, of course, is characterized by serpentine seamounts, which are unique serpentine mud volcanoes. And this is just showing, the lower figure shows the low resolution surface wave tomography with the box indicating the area in the higher resolution active source tomography. And you can see that the outer forearc is also very low velocity in the active source results. And there is a big route to the serpentine seamount going down into the forearc, which was not expected. And that's it.
Okay, thanks for bearing with us there. Helen again apologizes for that. And of course, we all learned something new about Zoom, but you can have multiple screen shares. Interesting. Was that the last presenters? Has anyone not gone yet? Okay, great. Okay, so if there are further questions, we'll wait. We can do a few minutes past the end of time. But yes, thank you. Thanks, Donna. Thank you to all the speakers for your great presentations. This is a really interesting session. And there's been a lot of really good questions in the chat. So any other questions that anyone want to raise their hand and ask a question? Oh, it looks like we got Helen back too. Donna.
Sorry, I wanted to raise my hand, but then I clapped. But I mean, both are relevant. I had a question for Hongfeng. It was really cool to see your results on linking the changing outer rise seismicity to slab geometry. And I'm not familiar with that part of the Mariana subduction zone. How dramatic are the changes in geometry that explain your changes in stress and seismicity? Is it is it a pretty dramatic change or a subtle one that leads to that pattern?
Well, actually, the trench depths definitely changed very much from the west near the Challenger Deep to the east towards Guam. So the water depths, I think, changed towards Guam. Then it's about 6,000, but then Challenger Deep is 11 kilometers. So that is pretty dramatic, I think. And that change, where we found the stress change, actually is just in between. So I think that is one factor. Another change is the change of the subducting plate geometry. So the dip angle near the west is relatively shallower. And of course, our resolution is still quite limited. So, but then in general, it's pretty shallow in the towards the west. They're probably less than 25 degree at the very shallow part. But then towards Guam, then that dip angle, the subducting slab increase, and then more than 35 around that range. But the seismicity distribution is still, especially towards Guam, and then out of our OBS coverage, so it's pretty low resolution. But then in general, the two factors are contributing in the slab geometry change and the trench, that depth change.
Interesting. Yeah. That's a really, it'd be interesting comparison to the Alaska Peninsula area, since we also have a westward increase in slab dip there. So picking apart contributions of slab geometry and pre-existing structures and the incoming plate there will be
certainly
with that area. So yeah, thanks for your talk.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions? We're likely going to get kicked out in about 8 minutes, but if anyone else would like to raise their hand and ask a question. If there aren't any questions, oh, yep, sure, go ahead.
I have a question for so basically all the people here. So we're trying to derive some focal mechanism solutions using our OBS data in Southern Mariana, but it turns out to be really difficult. And then some of the waveform-based modeling technique, it just suffered from whatever factors that contribute to the bad quality of the waveforms. I'm not sure about the Alaska experiment. It seems to be a much larger aperture array and much better coverage. Has anyone attempted to conduct like a waveform modeling based approach to derive some focal mechanisms or any other like waveform modeling results?
Hongfang, so my student Patrick Matulka has been working on this. I don't know if he's on, otherwise he could explain what he's done. But he's using waveform modeling to look at focal mechanisms of events. And so far he's just been testing it with this. There's a few events that have CMTs, and looks like he can get good results for those that agree, fairly well with the CMT solution. But he has not yet tried it for, the ones which were too small for a CMT solution. But we have the advantage there of some land stations. So, it obviously won't work for the really small events, and the larger events are recorded on some of the nearby land stations, which have higher quality data than the OBSs. So we think with a combination of the OBSs and land stations, we should be able to get some good results. And we also did Melody Eimer also did this with Mariana in the central Mariana area. So that some of that discussion is in her paper. But she could only solve for several of the larger events. So not a large number of events.
Okay, thanks.
Does anyone from who's worked in it with the Alaska data set have any comments on that question? If not, is there any other questions at this time from the audience? I actually have a question for Grace. You mentioned some of the difficulty and differences between using the land and OBS instruments. Have you noticed when looking at the OBS data if there's any differences additionally between how water depths of the stations or instrument design of the stations? And how might that contribute to building a reference data set for the techniques you want to apply?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the main difference is that the noise levels are different. But for sort of creating a catalog of local earthquakes, we find that we have to high pass filter the data above like 3 or 4 hertz to really see anything. And so at that point, the differences I think are pretty minimal between like what you can see in shallow water versus deeper water. I haven't really noticed any differences. Yeah, I haven't really noticed any differences, but I could encounter some for sure. One thing that I did notice is that the earthquake transformer for some reason performs really poorly in the outer rise. So it's just, I don't know why exactly. There could be a lot of reasons.
And so I see Susan Schwartz has her hand raised. So we'll, if you want to ask your question, again, we've got about 3 minutes before supposedly we get cut off. So if we don't get to it, continue on the Pathables website.
So I'm wondering if Erik found any transients, in the APG data. I mean, being he is here with us, who has a poster, I think, or certainly presented it at other meetings of a possible strain transient seen in the APG data.
Yeah, so I guess I can address that just to paint with a broad brush, and of course Bing can speak up if she'd like, but Bing's method uses essentially a machine learning algorithm to detect these transients, whereas I don't really have any kind of formalized detection method. It's essentially just very simple kind of by eye type thing. But for my part in these data, after applying these corrections that I showed, I haven't seen any clear evidence for transients. And it's really, pretty difficult on these pressure records because a lot of this non-tidal oceanography manifests itself in a very similar way to what you'd expect out of a slow slip earthquake. So both are kind of centimeter scale deformation, similar spatial patterns, and one thing that's difficult working with these more or less annual data sets, right, is that if you had kind of like a decade-long deployment or something like that, you could look for offsets, right, like consistent steps. But when you're just working with a year of data, you have these pretty strong seasonal signals, and you don't really have the ability to look for a static step. So yeah, I guess for my part, I haven't seen anything that I'm totally convinced by. But yeah,
I saw something in October, maybe a little bit sooner than Bing's, but that was just flashing by your slides. But
yeah.
Okay, so I think at this time there's still a couple questions in the chat, but if you haven't had a chance to ask a question that you want to, please follow up with the chat on the poster session on Pathables. And remember, Casey also put a link to the next poster session that'll be starting soon. So with that, I think we'll conclude this session. Thanks to all of our presenters today. Again, apologies for the technical glitch, and looking forward to continuing to see the rest of you for the rest of the meeting.